Thank you all for joining us on this lunch hour. My name is Rylan Smith, and I will be moderating this event along with my colleague, Christiana Ogletree. Christiana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Christiana, like Rylan said. It's great to see everyone here. Before we get started, I do want to let you all know that we will be having a brief Q&A at the end of the event, time permitting. So if you have any questions that you would like to drop in the chat or keep in mind for the end, please do so, and we'll be sure to get to them if we have time.
We have an exciting event planned for you today, so I don't want to waste any time before getting started. This month is Black History Month, a time to honor the history and achievements of Black Americans and to reflect on the centuries of struggle that have brought us to this moment. Black History Month is also a time to confront the deep racial inequities and the systemic racism that continue to plague our nation today, so that we may live up to our founding principles that all people are created equal. We had initially planned on being joined by 3 panelists today who are doing this hard work right here in St. Louis, on the streets, in government, and in the courts. Unfortunately, Kaylee Edwards, a community organizer here in St. Louis, will be unable to join us today, and we will certainly miss her perspective. But we can begin with somebody whom I had the honor to call my boss last summer as a legal intern investigating complaints of discrimination. That someone is Samara Wimbush, a senior investigator at the Missouri Commission on Human Rights. Ms. Wimbush, can you describe for our audience the work that you do?
I think that you are muted.
I love Zoom, but I wouldn't say I was very boss-like, but I do work for the Missouri Commission on Human Rights at this time. I'm also an attorney, and I think that our agency, as Rylan said, we investigate complaints of public accommodation, housing, and employment discrimination for Missouri citizens, as well as doing outreach for community agencies and organizations to train and also inform people about issues of discrimination and ways to eradicate those issues in our society, hopefully real soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing the work that you do. And Christina, would you now like to introduce our next panelist?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Last semester, I had a wonderful opportunity to hear our next panelist speak in my torts class on civil rights and Section 1983 claims. Javad Kazali is the co-founder of the St. Louis law firm Kazali Wersch LLC. Mr. Kazali, can you describe the work that you do for us?
Yeah, so our firm has, we do general litigation, but our 2 main subject areas are civil rights cases in the 1983 context, mostly with police brutality and excessive force cases. We have a lot of cases based on some protests that occurred in St. Louis. We've done cases all across the Midwest. And then we do a decent amount of immigration work too. I used to be, when I was at WashU, I did my last semester at WashU is when 9/11 happened. And then the day before I got picked for the DC clinic, I moved to DC, and I eventually took a job as a presidential management fellow, working at immigration, doing counterterrorism type stuff. So that's been an experience that's allowed me to work both in the civil immigration world and in the civil rights world.
Thank you so much, and thank you to both of our panelists for sharing the work you do. Our next question concerns racial justice in our community. Mr. Kazali, we can stick with you for a moment. As a civil rights attorney, how would you describe the current status of racial justice in St. Louis?
Non-existent. I mean, it's a joke. And permeates almost every portion of what happens in St. Louis. There's nothing in St. Louis that you can do without looking at it through a racial lens. Look at the fact that, like, here's an example. The state of Missouri split Missouri into 9 sections for COVID vaccines. One of them is called the Greater St. Louis area. The 3 events that have occurred have all been over 70 miles outside of St. Louis. They have been in areas like Bonne Terre, which are almost exclusively white. We haven't had mass vaccination clinics in any area of St. Louis where there's even, I would say, 30% Black people. You look at it when you talk about one of the big differences in St. Louis compared to other towns is that we don't have a robust public transportation system. So people have to drive. Look at how people still to this day are getting pulled over for having expired plates. Look at all of the areas in St. Louis that still to this day are have a majority of residents that are people of color. And those same towns, when you look at them, there are many of them that their whole government structure is white, their whole police structure is white, their whole fire department structure is white. And it's just been something that hasn't been fully addressed ever. We are very, very good in St. Louis at spending, and when I say St. Louis, I mean the greater St. Louis regional area, of every 18 months bringing in some big group to do a humongous study to tell us that there are major problems with racial equity. And then when it gets to the point of implementing all of those changes, we ignore it for 18 months and then we come back and we're like, oh my God, something happened. We need to study this again. And we do this study again. So one thing that we have going for us is we have all of this data. We have information from Forward through Ferguson. Now we just need people who have the guts to implement it.
That is an excellent point. Thank you. Ms. Winbush, the same question to you. How would you, from a government perspective, describe the current status of racial justice in St. Louis?
I mean, from a government perspective, the answer is not really any different. There isn't, I guess everyone's definition of justice might be different. So maybe it looks different to people depending on what your definition of justice is, but when you get down to results, there just isn't any way to say that racial justice exists in any real way in St. Louis. Resources are not distributed fairly to populations along racial lines, and outcomes are not distributed fairly to populations along racial lines, and there's no mechanism to get those things done. The example that Mr. Caselli brought up about COVID vaccinations and even COVID testing and all of that current crisis is a real microcosm of just really crystallizing the way that our institutions are set up to work against the idea of racial justice in a real way. So we're kind of, in St. Louis, the way our institutions are set up, you could kind of argue that they're set up to ensure that finding racial justice is kind of an uphill battle in some ways. So advocating for it is the mission that we're all here to talk about, I think, today. Advocacy is something that is very much needed in the St. Louis area because the fight is something that's necessary.
Absolutely. On another note, Mr. Caselli, do you think the fact that Missouri basically went all red this past November will impact the racial justice issue in St. Louis?
For sure. I mean, the money that comes to you, I mean, COVID is the perfect example of it. But you see how all across America, we have seen in response to George Floyd's murder that everybody for like a month and a half was like, wow, we need to do something about this. And there were proposals that were coming out about holding police accountable and looking at ways to equitably use our resources. And then all of that momentum was lost. Some places made some pretty drastic changes. But then what we've seen is that in super conservative places, especially in states like Missouri, and especially in states, this is something that most people don't talk about, that have term limits. So people can go in, do very extreme things, not be held accountable, and then move on. You see that the legislative branch is moving to the opposite extreme. Mm-hmm. What we're seeing in Missouri isn't, what we're seeing there is not reform of police. What we're seeing is passing bills that say, hey, if there's a protest in front of you and people are standing and you feel scared, you can drive through the group, hit the people, kill the people. That's fine. Our response to virtually everything from a legislative point of view in Missouri is more guns. Oh, we're having COVID vaccine clinics. Let's make it so that people can have guns at the COVID clinic. Oh, we don't want to limit whether or not you can have guns in court. You know, it's nuts. And we've done nothing to address these types of things. But here's funny. This is actually insanely disappointing. We saw one of the big conversations after George Floyd's murder was the conversation about defunding police. And defunding police has a different definition depending on who's using it. It can go everywhere from one spectrum of abolition to another spectrum that says we want to take lots of funds from the police department and reallocate that to social workers and people who can come and help with the unhoused and all that. And in Missouri, the idea of defunding police by the legislature was just villainized. It made anybody who even mentioned that, they painted with a paintbrush that said that you hate police and you don't want crime, you're pro-crime. But now there's a bill in front of the Missouri legislature to actually defund the police and actually hold them accountable. But not for doing things that are racist. It's if any state police officers help federal police officers investigate gun crimes to take guns away from people, then the bill here says that you can hold that police officer legally liable and money for that police department disappears. What? Like, of all the things we're focusing on right now, it's that we want our police to do less when it comes to gun crimes, where we're leading the country in that. And if so, we're going to defund them. So yeah, there are downstream effects of all of this.
Absolutely. Thank you for that insight. Ms. Winbush, to you as well, how would you characterize the impact of Missouri going deep red on racial justice here in our community?
Yeah, deep red, that's the way to put it. I mean, Missouri, I guess, didn't just go red, they went super red. Like the GOP in our state legislature now has kind of a super majority, so that they basically have a blank check to do whatever it is that they want, and they're going to use it. So I think that in a very real way, it affects not only what legislation is going to be passed and what that agenda is going to be, but that obviously is going to trickle down to our lives, our everyday lives. Like the Missouri Commission on Human Rights, the organization that I work for at this time, we enforce the Missouri Human Rights Act. And our ability to enforce that act is pretty much dictated by the decisions that the legislature makes in a real way. So in 2017, we lost the ability to file retaliation claims. We lost the ability to take specific landlords to court. We can no longer say for housing discrimination claims, if a landlord discriminates against someone on the basis of their race, we can no longer take that landlord to court for doing that discriminatory act, because we've been stripped of that power thanks to the legislature. So that Republican legislature taking that action has got a super power, and that's making a supreme impact on not just this law, but actually an individual's everyday life. So that's the kind of impact that going red, just that idea of going red, is going to have on justice and the idea of justice in the St. Louis area and in Missouri as a whole. I think that the tendency of this question then is what it ought to be doing is moving us toward thinking about not so much what the legislature going red is, what effect it's going to have on the St. Louis area, but what it is we're going to do about it in response. I hope that some of the future questions are going to move toward that.
Can I just add a few just like quick points to kind of add to that? When you talk, as Samara just did, about the changes in 2017, I've seen friends of mine who do employment discrimination law flex away from that because it has become so difficult to sustain an employment discrimination claim in Missouri. We have less attorneys who are willing to take those cases. And then we also have to look at how did Missouri become so deep red? People don't remember that in 2008, when Barack ran for president the first time, he lost Missouri by less than 3,000 votes, by 0.13%. It was the closest state in the country. And in this last election, it was a blowout. And I believe that one of the things that you have seen is that you have seen what, the well-intentioned white person that Martin Luther King talks about. There were many people in Missouri who thought, Missouri's fine. St. Louis is great. St. Louis County is a great place to raise kids. And then after Michael Brown was murdered, we had protests. We had people react in a way that I think was the logical response. At least some portions of the protests were. And there was a backlash. And you had a lot of, the conservative white Democrat that people talk about the radicalization of people. There was a lot of radicalization there of people who were like, I am in my mid 50s and 60s. I've lived here. This is a great place. How dare these protesters, these Black Lives Matter people, tell people that Ferguson is a bad place? They must be crazy. And we've seen the push to being red in Missouri. I don't think is something about finance. Is it something about white financial instability? It's directly a response to what happened with Black lives.
Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing. And I think if it's anything we can take away from both of your responses is that there's a long way to go. And we look forward to hearing your responses on how we do that. But first, let me ask, Last month, in a historic first, Vice President Kamala Harris became the highest ranking woman in the United States, excuse me, and the first Black American and the first person of South Asian descent to hold the nation's second highest offices. Will the policies proposed by her and President Biden lead to positive change in St. Louis regarding racial justice? Ms. Winbush, can we hear from you first?
It's kind of a tricky question. I think that there's always the possibility that the St. Louis area can kind of take from that federal example. But I think that St. Louis has got more grassroots work to do in its own backyard before any of that can really kind of trickle down and have that kind of effect. What the Biden-Harris team is hopefully going to be able to do will obviously have some kind of effect on just economically, hopefully, in particular, like what they want to do with the minimum wage and things like that will have some impact on bettering lives and things like that. And that is obviously going to improve people's circumstances. When you raise an economic profile, you raise quality of life and quality of living, and that kind of thing has a positive impact. But I think that for the issues that we're talking about here today, St. Louis has to look in its own backyard for the improvements that St. Louis needs to make.
And Mr. Kazali, what's your perspective on the issue?
I agree. I'm not so sure it's the Biden and Harris change. I think that the Biden and Harris administration are going to do a lot of things to stop the actions that the Trump administration took that specifically would harm St. Louis. Whether or not they're going to take specific actions to move St. Louis forward, I don't know. There have been some things that they have done, especially in the immigration context, that may not be totally pertinent, but have given me a little bit more faith that they're pushing for a more progressive agenda than they campaigned on. And that may be smart. I mean, one of the things we've seen that the Republicans do is they often talk in very middle of the road conservative ways. And then once they get elected behind the scenes, they go to ultra conservative stuff. I'm not opposed to seeing our people legislate way more progressively. One of the big things, though, that has happened that I think will impact St. Louis was our election for our congressional representative, Cori Bush. Lacy Clay, it's a very interesting dynamic. Representation matters, and hearing people acknowledge you matters. Lacy Clay, when he was our congressional representative, had one of the most progressive liberal voting records in America. If you look at what he voted for, it was very beneficial to what happened in St. Louis. But he never spoke about the St. Louis experience. One of the reasons I think he lost was the people in St. Louis didn't connect with him anymore. Hearing Cori Bush, hearing my friends from DC who aren't from St. Louis, from New York, from LA, text me and be like, I just heard Cori talk. Wow, she's amazing. And then knowing that I met Cori standing in Ferguson. You know, one of the people I see on this call right now is Rika Tyler. You know, she was one of the organizers in Ferguson, one of the main ones that I met there. First time I met Cori, she was standing next to Rika. Having somebody like that represent us, having somebody like that out in front talking and telling the story, not the story of, you know, lawyers like me who are doing fine, but telling the stories of people here who suffered from the threat of being unhoused, who have suffered from what happens when the economy leaves you behind, who've suffered from how we've treated everything north of Delmar differently than everything that we've treated south of Delmar. matters. So even though she's probably going to vote very similarly to what Lacey Clay did, I think that's going to have a decent amount of impact in St. Louis.
Ms. Winbush, I guess I'll get your perspective on this issue. How do you see Mrs. Bush's work impacting racial justice in our community?
I agree. I don't think there's anything to add to that. I mean, I think her voice is going to be a strong and powerful one to raise that profile on the national stage and hopefully divert more attention to what's really going on here.
I guess I'll stick with you for a second. Do you expect the policies and the message of the Biden-Harris administration now to affect your work directly?
Not really, not really. And that might be kind of because of the function of the work that I do, handling specific discrimination complaints and being in some ways bound by specific state laws and things like that. And it is in the hands of a state legislature. And it is in the hands of a state legislature that is not gonna be responsive to what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are planning to do. What a state legislature might be responsive to is people advocating for them to change the Missouri Human Rights Act and people advocating for them to give them better remedies against discrimination in their housing and on their jobs, and people voting out a Republican supermajority. And that is not, Kamala Harris doesn't really have any power to do that. Joe Biden doesn't really have any power to do that.
Mr. Khazali, do you expect the new administration to impact your work at all?
So I've got three different answers depending on which area of my work. When it comes to immigration, in just the first month, we've seen monumental change. We are seeing the government agreeing to things they haven't agreed to before. We're seeing them actually returning our phone calls. We're seeing crazy Trump rules taken away. One of the rules that Trump put in was that if you file a 100-page application for an immigration client, and if there's a box that you left blank, even though it's obvious that you left it blank. So if it asks, do you have any children? And you say no, and then the next question says, list all of your children, and you don't write not applicable in that box, Trump was rejecting applications. Hi, Brendan's baby. And Trump was rejecting applications like that. Insane. Any reason to reject an application, that policy was rescinded. One big one that you can see is my mother was a named plaintiff in the Muslim ban case that went to the Supreme Court that we lost. She has not been able to bring family members over here. My aunt's visa was approved, but in the 2 days it took for them to stamp her visa, Trump passed the Muslim ban. That has been rescinded. There's been monumental change. Now, there's a lot more work to be done. Just reverting back to the status quo from before Trump isn't enough. We've got to do a lot more. But in immigration, it's been huge. In the civil rights world, it could be huge. There are conversations about what we could do with qualified immunity. The idea that we have something in the law that says that's made up, utterly made up, that says, hey, a police officer could do something that is clearly unconstitutional. But if there wasn't a specific case in the courts that told them that, then we're going to give them a free pass. And one of the weird things about this is actually something that Justice Gorsuch has written about having a problem with. If Gorsuch is the one that saves us on that, that could be good. Legislation to address that would be great. But the biggest change for the civil rights world is going to be who our judiciary is. Right now on the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, that covers St. Louis. I think there's one person who was appointed by a Democrat. The two last people appointed in Missouri, you can look up and see for the Eastern District what their backgrounds are. There have been some decisions that have been pretty brutal. Bringing in more mainstream, qualified judges to the Eighth Circuit is going to make an enormous difference. And even in Samara's work could even affect some of the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we expand the employment provisions of federal discrimination law, can that be something that can backfill everything that the Missouri State Legislature has done to basically neuter the Human Rights Act? You know, there are places that this could be done. The problem that I see for Biden is there are Trump didn't just leave the country in disarray. There are about 1,000 fires they have to put out. You talk to an attorney in any field, and they're going to be like, this is where Trump destroyed stuff. This is where it went beyond. And fixing all of those is going to take a lot of time. And then can we move on to advancing things? Who knows? You know, President Obama's first whole year was taken up by trying to save the economy after the 2008 crash. So.
That is a great perspective. And I think to kind of bring it home to a more practical question, Ms. Winbush, I'll ask you, how should we be advocating for racial justice in St. Louis, both under this new administration and just in general?
I think there are as many ways as there are grains of sand, but any advocacy has to start with the community and engaging that community, figuring out what the needs are, what people are saying their needs are, and going from there to devising the strategy to get them heard. So advocacy for racial justice isn't going anywhere without really understanding what racial justice means to people who aren't getting it. So if you don't know who it is that is not getting justice, then you have to start by knocking on those doors and understanding why they don't feel that they've gotten that justice. That's the first step in any strategy. The first step in any advocacy movement, I think. In the St. Louis area, I know a lot of, I assume a lot of the grassroots work is being done on the ground by a lot of different organizations making inroads in those communities. Not everyone wants to, not everyone feels like those movements are worth doing. A lot of people are dispirited. A lot of people in the St. Louis area are disheartened by the results from even this past summer, what happened with the George Floyd movement and how it kind of fizzled out after a couple of months. So any advocacy for racial justice has got to be bolstered by not just getting people engaged, but having strategies for actual it's tough, I don't know, it's tough to communicate, but actual build in crumple zones for disappointment when you don't necessarily see the outcome immediately, because it won't happen. I don't know the language for that, but
No, I absolutely see what you're saying. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
that's some of those building blocks, because it's a keeping people engaged in the work is one of the most challenging aspects of working toward advocating for justice. And in an area like St. Louis, where it's been beset by kind of disappointment after disappointment and that kind of thing, you have to be prepared to meet that kind of, I won't say resistance, but you have to be prepared to meet that kind of, I've been out trying to, in particular, some of the efforts I've been registering voters and trying to get people engaged in local political organizing. And there is a lot of, I will say resistance, but just that feeling of nihilism and disheartening attitudes that you have to confront. So understanding the communities that you want to get involved in advocating for is one of the first real strategies that you have to confront.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. Mr. Kazali, I would love to get your perspective as well on how we can advocate during this.
This is the question that I always get into trouble with when I do something like this at WashU. So I'm a proud WashU alum. I think that there are, so when you say we, I'm assuming you're talking about the students from WashU.
Yeah,
who are interested in this. So advocacy starts at home. All right. There are a few of your professors there who are just personal heroes of mine. When it comes to coming up with the policies to address this from a legal point of view, there are very few people who are policy-wise powerhouses like Kim Norwood. Get to know Kim, see the things that Kim's doing, see what she did there. But the WashU response post-Ferguson has been, the WashU law response post-Ferguson has been dismal. All right. One of my personal favorite people in the legal community, you saw his baby on, if you saw it, is Brendan Rodiger. He's a professor at SLU Law, right? SLU Law was 100% on the front lines. They were bailing protesters out of jail. They had their students doing legal work on this. The biggest TRO that happened in this case, SLU Law was involved in. They decided to take their resources as litigators and aim it directly at the injustice. And I've pushed the university. I know that some of the professors like Professor Norwood and Professor Tokars and Professor Majarian have pushed this. I still have not seen the power of WashU law in courts helping us. I've been told that there are research studies coming out. The other place is all politics are local. We have a big mayoral race coming up. 4 years ago, when the current mayor was elected, she did something that was fairly radical at the time. She appointed a deputy mayor for racial equity and priority initiatives. Her name's Nicole Hudson. I've known Nicole since I was in junior high. WashU is lucky because Nicole eventually left that job and she's started a foundation at WashU called the Academy for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It is something that is an inner looking academy at WashU to look at racial justice and diversity initiatives at the school. Are we giving the students the tools, the safety that they need? Are professors looking at everything through a racial lens? But at the same time, once Nicole left, that deputy mayor position has never been filled in St. Louis. It was so important that we had it for a year, and then we just decided, we're done with it. It's a joke. So mayors have a lot of power here. The mayor of St. Louis, that election is in less than a month. Looking at who the candidates are and say, who are the people who are looking at things through a racial justice lens, not just because they're women, or not just because they're Black, or not just because they're lawyers, or anything. Just look at what these people are saying and what they're putting forward, how they're dealing with the St. Louis Police Department that takes up the great majority of all the funds. I mean, it was something like, I think, I'll look it up before this is done, but less than 1% of our budget, like less than half of 1% of our budget, goes to health and human services things to help our people, where more than something like 60% of our budget goes to policing our people. Who are the people who are going to look to change those resources? I think if you do any research, you'll see who those people are. But those are the things to get involved with, like in the next month, is make sure that you're all registered to vote locally, that you vote in this mayoral election, and then push your school, push your dean and say, why aren't we there?
Thank you. I think
They do still call me though and ask me to donate money.
well, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, questioning and challenging the institution that we're a part of is absolutely important, and I'm glad that you raised that. I think we're at a point where we have a few minutes left in our time. So if anyone has any questions that they would like to direct to our panelists, feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat.
I messed up something.
Of
Lisa,
course.
who's put this in here, just wrote, she's one of your professors there, waving there, that she did point out that the First Amendment Clinic is representing some protesters. My frustration on this, and the work that she and Greg are doing is amazing. My frustration is that, and Lisa, you can chime in right here, that clinic is fairly new, right? I mean, it didn't exist before then. And that type of work is great. What I'm talking about is specifically like during the Michael Brown protests, a Wash U student was arrested and charged by the Ferguson Police Department. And I ended up doing that case pro bono because I couldn't find anybody who would be approved of by Wash U faculty to do that case. It's great that we've got this on the First Amendment Clinic. Hopefully they'll be able to push more to expand that into some more civil rights type stuff. That is fairly different than what the litigation clinic though is doing at SLU and some of the other places. So that's a great first step. And I would hope that there's a distinct effort to make sure that a good portion of that First Amendment work is aimed locally. So you can throw it to Lisa and ask her what she thinks, because I forgot about them and I'm bad.
No, thanks, Javad. And I know, I mean, I take your larger point, but I did just want to get a plug in for the First Amendment Clinic for students who, are 2Ls or 1Ls and who might be interested down the line. I signed in today because I saw that Kalia, who was supposed to be one of your speakers, she's actually one of our clients representing Kalia and two other plaintiffs, one of whom is a Wash U undergrad who were involved in protests in Florissant last summer. And I don't, if some of you were here in town over the summer, still following St. Louis news, there was a, pretty violent crackdown on people who were outside the police department in Florissant for a number of nights, protesting the actions of a Florissant police officer and his colleagues in hitting a suspect with his vehicle and then lying about it, basically. And so, if for folks who might be interested, I did just want to get a plug in for the First Amendment Clinic, but I do take your larger point, Javad.
And sorry to chime in again as the Wash U alum. One of my best experiences at Wash U was the clinic program. I mean, I did the DC clinic, which is what got me into the government. I did 1 year of the public defender clinic, was amazing. I don't know if Peter's still running that, but he does an amazing job with that. It gave me a lot of the litigation skills that I still use to this day. So use your clinics.
Absolutely. Thank you both for sharing that. It looks like we have a question from Alexander, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes. I heard a lot of the emphasis on local stuff, and I actually just found out about the mayoral election a couple days ago, and so I was wondering if there are any specific endorsements that either panelist would want to make of like what specific candidates might make a positive difference in this area.
I mean, I don't think it's unknown that I have appeared on when Tashara Jones did a city hall, a town hall meeting on public safety issues in St. Louis. She asked me to be on that panel, and I would not have been on that panel if I didn't agree with a lot of the things that she did. You know, I think we have two decent progressive candidates in Tashara and Kara Spencer. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg was once asked how many women should be on the Supreme Court, her answer was 9, because we've had 9 men on the Supreme Court for many, many years, and it's our turn. You know, so much of the St. Louis problem is that we have not centered the issues of our people of color, of our Black women, of a lot of the spine of the city. And if you're going to give me 2 decent candidates that are different on things, I'm going to pick the one who is more willing to look at the problems that we have with the police department, and B, I think that's clearly Treasurer Jones. And B, if there's ever a tiebreaker right now, you know, you go back to the question about Kamala. Let Black women lead. It's time.
I can't endorse anyone. I think I'm here in my official employment capacity. I can't endorse anybody, but I would say that 1 or 2 of the candidates, if you look into them at all, have made it a part of their platform to present issues and present themselves as considering issues through a specific racial justice lens. And some of the candidates have specifically said that they will not do that and do not think it's valuable to do that. And you can easily figure out who they are.
Thank you both for sharing on that. And I hope everybody, of course, votes in the upcoming nonpartisan primary, and then, of course, the general election in April. So with that, that concludes our event. And I would like to thank Ms. Ogletree for organizing and moderating this event along with me. And a special thank you to the Black Law Students Association for co-sponsoring this event with the American Constitution Society. And of course, a thank you to Mr. Kazali and Ms. Wimbush for sharing their perspectives. I certainly appreciated your input, and I'm sure everyone else who attended did as well. So if no one else has anything else to add, I think we'll conclude.
Thank you so much, everyone.
We can stick around for a few more minutes if there are folks who want to stay a little late and continue asking questions, as long as our panelists are able to stay for another 5 minutes or so.
I don't have anything to do.
I did want to ask, for either of you, if you have any opinions, the advice that you gave about what we can do specifically.
I have opinions on everything.
Okay, good. The advice you gave on what we can do specifically in the WashU Law School was very useful. And kind of building off of that, do you have any local organizations that you would like to plug that you think would be good for law students to get involved in who are interested in helping further racial justice? I'm thinking things like Arch City Defenders, EHOC, anything like that.
One of my favorite organizations that is in St. Louis, because remember, racial justice isn't just Black people. You know, immigrants are a huge portion of this. St. Louis wouldn't exist right now if it wasn't for how many Bosnians we brought over in the 80s and 90s, you know, that stabilized our economy here. The MICA project, I mean, what Nicole and Jessica did, they're both WashU JD MSWs. One of them graduated #1 in her class. With a #1 from WashU Law, you can go and basically write your ticket. And what they decided to do was start a nonprofit to help immigrants. Because in the St. Louis area, in the immigration community, when I say the St. Louis area, that means Springfield, Illinois, down to Carbondale, to St. Louis, to Jeff City, to Columbia, down South Missouri, that humongous window. I think there are 6 total nonprofit immigration attorneys. And some of them work with Catholic Legal Services. Some of them do other stuff at the same time. The fact that these 2 women have built something, and one of their other colleagues who was there is now running your immigration clinic there. Katie is awesome. But yeah, the MICA project, I feel, is worth doing stuff with if you're interested, because they do just God's work.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I'm always looking for recommendations for groups that we can try to get folks who are interested involved in.
Especially if you have people who speak different languages in Spanish. It's always a need.
Gotcha. If anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I don't want to keep our panelists any longer than we need to.
Can I just call on Brendan and start asking him questions? Brendan, do we get to see the baby again, or you gone? You're on mute. Come on, man. There we go.
There we go.
So, I mean, one of the people you should hear from at some point to have talk is Brendan. I mean, the work that he's been doing on these same topics, you know, I mean, let's put it this way. You've heard the things that I've said today. I am a conservative compared to Brendan, you know, like he will give you a lot more truth on this, and you guys should hear from him. I think it's great having the law schools work together. They do a great job working together when it comes to the public fair, the public interest fair. Did I miss anything, Brendan?
No, I'm a WashU grad, you know.
I know that. And he you know, he made his life in Edwardsville, where I'm from too. You know, once you've dealt with, you know, Madison County, you can survive anything.
Well, thank you for the connection. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Definitely. All right. I know that some folks need to get to class, so I think this is a good place to wrap it up. But like Christiana and Rylan said, thank you both so much for being here. We really appreciated it.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Anytime.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Oh, and Samara, my sister's name, she's a WashU grad, but her name is Samira.
Oh,
So I love the name.
I haven't met a Samira or a Samara.
I've met one Samara before. I think like 2 or 3 Samiras, but not many. Other than a super skinny, half Iranian, half Japanese table tennis player, I think I'm the only Javad Kazali in the world. Hey, Brendan, you owe me a call.
All right.
Bye, guys.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.